December 1987, a team of federal agents breached the walls of a fortified compound in Coconut Grove, Miami. They expected to find drugs, weapons, and cash. They found all three: Uzis, a MAC-10 submachine pistol, 4 steel safes, one of them bolted to the floor of a child's bedroom. During the breach, someone on the second floor hurled a $50,000 brick of cash out a window. It struck a federal agent in the head. But the most dangerous things on that property weren't the weapons. They were the spotted leopards, fully grown, unchained, prowling the manicured grounds like guard dogs with better instincts. The agents had to navigate past them to secure the perimeter. The man who owned that compound, those leopards, and the $79 million empire they protected was Mario Tabraue. He was the most feared independent drug lord in South Florida. He ran his operation through a pet store. He dressed his chimpanzee in a diamond bracelet and a Rolex. And he had recently used a circular saw to solve a problem that a machete couldn't. He was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. He served 12. Today, he runs a zoo. Most drug kingpins come from poverty. Mario Tabraue came from espionage. He was born in the mid-1950s into the tightly wound, deeply political Cuban exile community of South Florida, a world where the line between patriot and criminal had been deliberately erased by the United States government. His father, Guillermo Tabraue, was a veteran of the failed 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion and a committed operative within the Movimiento de Recuperación Revolucionaria, one of the most aggressive anti-Castro exile factions operating out of South Florida. The MRR ran sabotage missions, commando raids, and intelligence operations against Havana, often with direct logistical support from American intelligence. Guillermo wasn't a foot soldier. He was the paymaster, the man who managed the large sums of covert funding that kept those operations running. But by the mid-1970s, the political energy behind the Cuban exile movement had faded, and the operatives who had built those smuggling networks didn't simply retire. They redirected. The routes that had moved weapons and cash across the Caribbean, the airstrips, the maritime corridors, the offshore accounts, the culture of institutional silence, were perfectly suited for moving something far more profitable. Only the product needed to change. Guillermo made the transition seamlessly. He spent 4 years embedded as a deep-cover informant inside the DEA's classified Deacon project, operating under the alias Abraham Diaz. He maintained relationships with CIA handlers and prominent figures in anti-communist networks stretching from Miami to Central America. He was, in the most literal sense, a man the federal government could not touch, because the federal government needed him. For the young Mario, growing up in this household meant absorbing a very specific education. He watched his father operate in a space where the American government didn't just tolerate illegal activity, it facilitated it. His father's colleagues trafficked narcotics under the cover of anti-communist operations. Nobody went to prison. Nobody faced consequences. The lesson wasn't subtle. Crime, conducted under the right political cover, carried no consequences. That belief that the rules applied to other people became the defining feature of Mario Tabraue's psychology. It would fuel everything he built and blind him to everything that eventually tore it apart. His obsession with exotic animals surfaced early, long before the cocaine money made it possible to indulge on a grand scale. It wasn't a hobby. It was a compulsion, a need to possess and control dangerous, beautiful creatures that most people could only see behind glass. That compulsion would eventually provide the perfect cover for his empire. But even in the beginning, before the drugs, it revealed something essential about his character. Mario Tabraue didn't just want wealth. He wanted dominion over animals, over people, over the rules of the world he moved through. By the late 1970s, he had found the perfect vehicle for all of it. His entry point was marijuana, bulk shipments moving through the porous maritime borders of South Florida. coordinated through the networks his family's anti-Castro connections had already established. Small aircraft from Colombia landed at unmonitored strips in the Bahamas and the Florida Keys. Waterproofed bales were dropped at low altitude into the Everglades, where recovery crews waited in the sawgrass. Between 1976 and 1986, the Tabraue syndicate moved an estimated 500,000 pounds of marijuana into the United States. The margins were modest by Miami standards, but the volume was enormous. And Tabraue was patient. He was building infrastructure. Then cocaine arrived, and patience gave way to ambition. As Miami transformed into the financial capital of the Western Hemisphere's drug trade, Tabraue pivoted without hesitation. His syndicate coordinated fleets of small aircraft out of Colombia, landing at the same unmonitored strips or executing low-altitude drops into the vast, unpatrolled Everglades, where recovery crews waited in airboats. The same routes, the same pilots, the same infrastructure, all repurposed for a product that generated exponentially more profit per pound. By the time the operation reached its full scale, the syndicate would generate an estimated $75 to $79 million in revenue, more than most legitimate import businesses would see in a lifetime. But what separated Tabraue from the other operators flooding Miami, the ones who bought Lamborghinis and shot each other in mall parking lots, was his choice of cover. He established Zoological Imports Unlimited, a business that specialized in the legal importation and sale of exotic animals, rare birds, and reptiles. On the surface, it was a niche commercial enterprise. In practice, it was the most elegant front operation in South Florida. The logic was nearly airtight. An exotic animal business naturally required heavy, secured crates moving through international customs on a regular basis. It justified enormous, irregular cash flows that would have raised immediate flags in almost any other industry. And the animals themselves provided a layer of protection that no amount of operational security could match. The overwhelming stench of animal enclosures and waste masked the chemical signatures that drug detection dogs were trained to find. The genuine physical danger of the cargo, venomous snakes, aggressive primates, big cats, made customs agents deeply reluctant to conduct thorough, prolonged inspections. Nobody wanted to spend 45 minutes disassembling a crate when there was a West African green mamba coiled somewhere inside it. To insulate himself from direct exposure, Tabraue elevated his brother-in-law, Orlando Sicilia, to the position of operational second-in-command. Sicilia was everything Tabraue needed in a frontman: charismatic, fearless, and deeply loyal. He handled the physical product, coordinated the stash houses, collected the cash, and interfaced directly with buyers. Over tapped phone lines he didn't know were tapped. He referred to ounces as little birds and kilos as big birds, admiring bricks of cocaine as pure rock and a pretty thing. He showed up to deals in paisley suits with the sleeves rolled up and aviator sunglasses he never took off, even indoors. He was the visible face of the operation, absorbing the street-level risk so that Tabraue could retreat to his compound and play the eccentric animal collector. This structure, Tabraue as architect, Sicilia as executor, the zoo as camouflage, allowed the syndicate to scale rapidly. But the element that truly elevated Tabraue from successful smuggler to untouchable kingpin was his systematic corruption of local law enforcement. He didn't just evade the police, he employed them. The syndicate reportedly spent up to $1 million a year on bribes alone. Tabraue paid a documented $150,000 to the acting police chief of Key West to ensure smuggling routes through the Keys remained unmolested. He bought cooperation from officials across Miami-Dade County, and in his most brazen display of perceived invincibility, he used off-duty uniformed Miami police officers to collect, count, and transport his drug money. The cops weren't looking the other way. They were on the payroll, performing the functions of a private security firm and an armored car service, wearing their badges while they did it. Within the Miami underworld, Mario Tabraue earned a title that said everything about how his organization functioned and how he saw himself within it. They called him the chairman of the board. At the height of his power, Tabraue lived inside his own mythology. The Coconut Grove compound was the physical manifestation of everything he believed about himself. Behind its high walls, spotted leopards prowled the grounds like living proof of his dominance. Panthers, pythons, cobras, raptors. The property was a private kingdom, half fortress and half menagerie. The interior felt less like a residence and more like the lair of someone who had watched too many Bond villains and thought they were being understated. Mirrored ceilings, a custom-built throne embossed with his initials. Federal agents who later cataloged the property compared it to the set of Scarface. Tabraue never objected to the comparison. He cultivated it. A steady stream of Ferraris, Maseratis, and Jaguars flowed in and out of his pet store at all hours, advertising to anyone paying attention. And by this point, federal agents were paying very close attention that Zoological Imports Unlimited was not surviving on exotic bird sales alone. But the most vivid expression of Tabraue's peak wasn't the mansion, or the cars, or the leopards. It was Caesar. Caesar was a chimpanzee. Tabraue didn't keep him in a cage. He dressed the animal in bespoke turtlenecks and New York Yankees baseball caps, hung a heavy gold rope necklace with a 50-peso gold coin around his neck, clasped an 18-karat diamond-encrusted ID bracelet to his wrist, and strapped a lady's Rolex presidential watch on for good measure. Then, he put Caesar in the passenger seat of his Mercedes-Benz and drove through the streets of Miami while the chimpanzee waved a lit Cuban cigar out the window. This wasn't eccentricity. It was a message. It told the Miami underworld and every badge in the city that Mario Tabraue had so much money and so much protection that he could turn his primate into a walking provocation, and nobody would do a thing about it. It was the behavior of a man who had stopped believing consequences applied to him, and that belief had a foundation. His father's intelligence ties provided a psychological safety net, the deep state connections that had shielded the family for decades. His bribery network had neutralized local law enforcement. His operational compartmentalization kept him insulated from the street. His syndicate laundered revenue through real estate, offshore accounts, attorney trust funds, and falsified loan structures, insulating the money almost as effectively as the man. He maintained a network of enforcers across South Florida, and associates understood that disloyalty didn't result in termination from the organization. It resulted in termination. Everything in his environment confirmed what he wanted to believe, that he had built something permanent. The empire even intersected with legitimate political life in ways that would later prove deeply uncomfortable. Cecilia, the loyal frontman, was married to Barbara Rubio, the older sister of a teenager named Marco Rubio, who would one day become a United States senator and presidential candidate. During the peak years of the operation, the teenage Rubio earned $10 a week at Cecilia's West Kendall home, washing dogs and building animal cages. While the future politician cleaned kennels, Cecilia was using the spare bedrooms of that same house to cut, weigh, and package kilograms of cocaine inside emptied cigarette cartons for nationwide distribution. The mundane and the monstrous, separated by a hallway. Tabraue had every opportunity to step back. He had a legitimate animal business that could have sustained a comfortable life. He had millions in offshore accounts. He had his father's proven template for quiet survival in the shadows of the intelligence world. But the empire was never just about money. It was about the feeling of being beyond consequences. And that feeling had become more addictive than anything his organization shipped through the Everglades. The thing about buying local police chiefs is that you start to believe you've bought the entire system. The violence had always been present in Tabraue's operation. In the upper levels of the drug trade, enforcement wasn't optional. It was structural. But most operators who lasted understood the difference between necessary and reckless, between quiet removal and public spectacle. Mario Tabraue either never learned that distinction or stopped caring about it. In July 1980, his organization discovered that an associate named Larry Nash was secretly working as an informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In the hierarchy of threats to a drug syndicate, a federal informant ranked at the very top. And there were ways to handle that problem. Quiet methods, deniable methods, the kind experienced operators employed precisely because they didn't invite the sort of federal attention that dismantled empires. Tabraue chose a different approach. Nash was lured to his property. He didn't leave. The attempt to dispose of the remains with a machete failed. The blade couldn't get through bone. So they retrieved a power circular saw, the kind used for framing houses, and finished the job. What was left was burned in a charcoal-filled horse trough on Tabraue's own property, doused in lighter fluid until there was nothing to identify. The act was an expression of absolute contempt for Nash, for the ATF, for any authority that presumed to operate inside Tabraue's domain. But it was also the single worst strategic decision of his criminal career, and he made it without hesitation. Because Tabraue had spent years buying off municipal police departments and local officials, and that experience had calcified into a belief that all law enforcement operated the same way. It did not. The Key West police chief could be purchased for $150,000. The ATF, the DEA, and the FBI could not. The mutilation of a federal informant on his own property with power tools guaranteed that every federal agency with jurisdiction would coordinate to bring him down, operating entirely outside the local corruption networks he'd spent millions constructing. The flaw compounded. Less than a year later, his first marriage was disintegrating, and his wife, Maria, knew everything. The roots, the money, the names. When she allegedly threatened to take what she knew to federal authorities, the problem was handled the same way his problems were always handled, not with discretion, but with finality. Maria was found dead. Prosecutors charged that Tabraue had ordered it, allegedly using a 16-year-old as the instrument. What Tabraue didn't understand, what his hubris physically prevented him from seeing, was that the system he'd been beating was the local one. The federal case was already being built. The wiretaps were already recording. The surveillance teams hadn't gone anywhere. The circular saw that cut through Larry Nash had also cut through the last barrier between Mario Tabraue and the full, undivided attention of the United States government. And there was a deeper structural problem with everything he'd built. Fear is a terrible foundation for loyalty. It holds only as long as you're the most frightening thing in the room. The moment the federal government becomes more frightening than you are, every person you've terrorized becomes a potential witness. Tabraue had spent a decade ensuring that no one in his orbit would dare betray him. He hadn't considered what would happen when betraying him became the safest option available. The investigation that would end everything was called Operation Cobra, a name chosen as a deliberate nod to the reptile-filled pet store at the center of the syndicate. Federal agents, fully aware that the Miami Police Department was compromised, bypassed local law enforcement entirely. They planted electronic listening devices inside Zoological Imports Unlimited, inside Tabraue's home, inside the homes and offices of his associates. They installed pen registers on his phone lines. They created a comprehensive communications matrix, documenting every conversation, every deal, every threat, every casual reference to the business operations he was conducting in code. The wiretaps revealed the extent of the corruption. They documented the Miami police officers who regularly collected money from Sicilia. They recorded conversations where those same officers discussed security concerns and police movements with the syndicate, essentially providing real-time intelligence from the police department to the drug operation. They captured the moment Cecilia learned that someone had been skimming money from the operation and the casual, offhand way he discussed terminating the problem. For 3 years, federal agents listened and recorded. They let the operation continue functioning at full scale, gathering evidence, documenting patterns, building a case so comprehensive that no local corruption could touch it, that no amount of bribery could suppress it. They were patient because they knew something Tabraue had stopped believing, that the federal system operated under different rules than the local one. The arrest came on December 3, 1987. Federal agents descended on multiple locations simultaneously: Tabraue's compound, Cecilia's home, the pet store itself, stash houses across Miami. They found cash, weapons, and animals. They documented the full scope of an operation that had operated in plain sight for a decade. Tabraue was charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine, money laundering, RICO violations, and murders. His co-defendants included Cecilia and a network of corrupted law enforcement officers. The trial lasted months. The evidence was overwhelming. Wiretap conversations, documented transactions, testimony from associates who understood that cooperation was their only option. In 1989, Mario Tabraue was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. No kingpin expects to serve his full sentence. They plan for corruption, legal maneuvers, appeals, all the mechanisms through which wealthy criminals reduce their time. But Tabraue's case was structured in a way that made traditional reduction nearly impossible. The RICO convictions carried minimum mandatory sentences. The murders were federal cases, prosecuted outside any jurisdiction where corruption could operate. The appeals process slowly, methodically, rejected every challenge. By the mid-1990s, nearly a decade into his sentence, Tabraue had absorbed what he was no longer willing to admit, that he would likely spend the remainder of his natural life in federal prison. The man who had dressed a chimpanzee in Rolexes and driven through Miami feeling invulnerable was now a prisoner in a series of federal facilities: USP Leavenworth in Kansas, then USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania, later transferred to the federal prison system's less restrictive facilities. But something shifted during his incarceration. The man who had built an empire on the exploitation of exotic animals developed something that looked like genuine concern for animal welfare. Maybe it was the perspective that only prison provides, the removal of context that allows you to see your own behavior without the narrative you've constructed around it. Maybe it was genuine conversion. Maybe it was survival psychology, understanding that the one thing that might reduce his sentence was to become something other than the man he'd been. Tabraue petitioned for a prison transfer to a facility that allowed him to work with animals. He volunteered in the prison's institutional animal care program. He educated himself on animal welfare standards, conservation biology, and the ethics of animal captivity. He corresponded with legitimate zoologists and animal welfare advocates. Slowly, he was rehabilitated, not as a businessman or as a drug lord, but as a caretaker. The transformation earned notice from federal officials. It earned notice from animal welfare advocates, and it began to influence the calculus of his sentence. In the federal system, sentence reduction typically comes through two mechanisms: direct appeals, which almost never succeed in high-profile drug cases, and executive clemency, which requires political support and compelling personal narrative. By the 1990s, the first mechanism had been exhausted. The second mechanism was theoretically possible if the right circumstances aligned. Those circumstances began to crystallize in 1999, when federal prosecutors and correctional officials began to acknowledge that Tabraue's rehabilitation appeared to be genuine. His institutional record was clean. His behavior had been exemplary for over a decade. Most significantly, his expertise and passion for animal care had become genuinely useful to the federal system. He wasn't simply an inmate anymore. He was a resource, someone whose unique knowledge and obsessive attention to detail had created animal welfare infrastructure in federal prisons that didn't exist before. The reduction came incrementally. Sentences were commuted, then appealed, then modified. Years were subtracted. 5, then 10, then more. What had been a 100-year sentence became 60 years, then 40, then 30. In 1999, after serving approximately 12 years of his 100-year sentence, Mario Tabraue was released. The released prisoner found himself in a nation that had moved on without him. The 1980s drug wars felt distant. Miami had evolved. The Colombian cartels had fragmented. The enforcement focus had shifted to other enemies: terrorism, manufacturing, the new synthetic drugs that would eventually claim more American lives than cocaine ever had. Tabraue was no longer a kingpin. He was a 50-something ex-convict with extensive knowledge of exotic animals and a psychological need to control dangerous creatures. He was also, by federal standards, a low-risk offender who had demonstrated genuine behavioral transformation. He relocated to Central Florida. He used his legitimate knowledge of animal care to establish the Zoological Imports Unlimited facility that had once been a front operation and was now simply a zoo. A small facility housing rescued and confiscated exotic animals, offering education programs and animal welfare services to communities that had traditionally had no access to such things. The second life of Mario Tabraue looked nothing like the first. He wasn't trafficking narcotics. He wasn't buying police chiefs. He wasn't adorning primates with jewelry to celebrate his dominance. He was a caretaker, still obsessed with animals, still requiring control, still operating in the shadows. But now, the shadows were legal, and the animals were in his care by something approximating ethical practice. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had constructed the most elaborate criminal front operation around exotic animals ended up genuinely dedicating the latter part of his life to animal care. The fake had become real. The criminal theater had become authentic practice. He gave interviews about his past, acknowledging the murders, the drug trafficking, the corruption. He didn't express remorse in the way that prosecutors or victim advocates might want. He expressed understanding, detached analysis of how his decisions had constructed a criminal enterprise and how that enterprise had been methodically dismantled. He spoke about his transformation less as redemption and more as a fundamental shift in what gave him meaning. The animals mattered to him in a way that money and dominance no longer did, which raises the question that hangs over his entire narrative. Was it genuine? Did Mario Tabraue actually transform, or did he simply transfer the pathology that drove him to build a $100 million drug empire toward a more socially acceptable outlet? The answer probably depends on what you're measuring. By the metrics of rehabilitation, behavioral records, institutional performance, demonstrated expertise, Tabraue appears to have genuinely changed. By the metrics of psychology, the fundamental obsessive need to control and dominate, the willingness to operate outside legal structures, the construction of alternative realities where his actions are justified, it's far less clear that anything changed at all. He moved from controlling the supply of narcotics to controlling the supply of animals. He moved from organizing human exploitation to organizing animal care. He moved from the criminal world to the legitimate world. But the underlying drive to possess, to dominate, to construct personal kingdoms that appears to have been constant. The Miami drug lord was transformed into the zoo operator. The question of whether this constitutes redemption or simply an evolution of the same pathology remains open, probably forever. What's remarkable about Mario Tabraue's story isn't the rise or the fall. Hundreds of drug traffickers have built cocaine empires in Miami. Hundreds have been caught and imprisoned. The rise and fall is structural, the product of market forces and enforcement efforts, and the inevitable mathematics of a legal enterprise. What's remarkable is the second act. Very few men who receive 100-year federal sentences ever see daylight again. Most die in prison. Some spend decades there before their appeals are exhausted and they accept life. Tabraue, through a combination of genuine behavioral transformation, strategic legal maneuvering, political alignment, and documented rehabilitation, served 1/8 of his sentence. He was released into a world that understood him as a historical figure, the drug lord from a previous era, the chairman of the board, the man with the cocaine-filled zoo. But he was released into that world at an age where most men are thinking about retirement and grandchildren, and he has spent the subsequent decades building a legitimate animal facility that operates within legal structures. Whether this constitutes redemption depends entirely on what you believe redemption means. whether it represents justice, whether a man who ordered murders should be released after 12 years, is a question the federal system answered and then tried not to examine too closely. Whether it proves that transformation is possible, or simply that the right context and obsession can redirect essentially unchanged pathology, remains a matter of perspective. What's certain is that Mario Tabraue is still here, still building his kingdom of animals, still obsessed with control and dominion, still operating in the shadows of legitimacy. The criminal empire collapsed. The empire of animals survived.